While hostilities between the world's two largest economies have escalated as a result of the trade war, people in China seem divided on how their country should respond to the United States. To Alex Zhou, a 22-year-old from Beijing, the trade war has barely changed his view of the U.S. as an attractive destination. Zhou, who graduated from a Beijing university a few months ago, still recalls with fondness his summer trip to the U.S. in 2015. "My parents love Yellowstone National Park very much, but I prefer big cities like New York," he said. When Zhou and his family were in the U.S., Donald Trump was a property tycoon who had recently emerged as a leading Republican contender in the 2016 presidential election. Among the litany of grievances he vowed to tackle as president were China's allegedly unfair trade practices. Nearly 2 years into his presidency, the resulting trade war has intensified fears that it will undermine global economic growth. The confrontation has also spread to multiple fronts as Washington seeks to counter Beijing's moves to expand its influence around the world with ambitious investment and infrastructure plans. Zhou said he felt a little upset that Trump was targeting China, but "I can understand him because, as an American president, he is supposed to defend the interests of the U.S., not China. They cannot slow-walk this. U.S. expects immediate action from China after trade truce," says Trump advisor Larry Kudlow. So far, the trade dispute has involved punitive tariffs by the U.S. against a total of $250 billion worth of Chinese products, and Trump has threatened to impose tariffs on all remaining Chinese imports, about $267 billion more in Chinese goods, if Beijing fails to address U.S. demands over the course of the 90-day truce agreed in Argentina. These demands include improved market access and intellectual property protections for American companies, cutting industrial subsidies, as well as slashing a $375 billion trade gap between the two countries. But Zhou said that made little difference to his impressions of the U.S. "I think the U.S. remains very attractive, especially in the areas of advanced science and technologies, and many of my classmates and friends have worked really hard to go to the U.S. for further education," he said. So far, the U.S. remains a top destination for Chinese students, according to the 2018 Open Doors report on international educational exchange. More than 363,000 Chinese students, almost a third of international students, enrolled for the 2017-18 school year in U.S. universities, an increase of 3.6% compared with the previous school year. Guo Bei, a vice president at EIC Education, one of the leading overseas education groups in China, said despite trade tensions, the U.S. remained an attractive destination for Chinese students looking for a better education. "Most students want to have a wider vision when studying in the U.S., she said. A diversified way of thinking, open values and a high standard of teaching are among the top reasons to choose the U.S., Guo said, adding that majors in finance, management as well as engineering were particularly appealing to Chinese students. Trade war: why U.S. and China remain so far apart on intellectual property rights. In June, the U.S. State Department introduced new screening measures for visa applications from Chinese students in sensitive research fields as part of Washington's effort to curb intellectual property theft. The move, which addresses a major complaint by Trump about Chinese trade practices, drew widespread concern that the Obama administration's visa policy towards Chinese students may be reversed. Such concerns, Guo said, had become apparent this year as her company had seen a rapid growth in the number of applications to universities in Britain. Many students who planned to go to the U.S. have changed their minds and now want to go to the U.K., Guo said. United States voids 10-year multiple-entry visas for some Chinese researchers. Censors in Beijing have also been watching the trade war with caution. Chinese media, which is strictly controlled by the government, has refrained from laying blame on the U.S. president or his officials, despite its aggressive rhetoric against Trump's trade policies. Andrew Polk, co-founder of Beijing-based research firm Trivium China, said Beijing might be seeking to avoid any hint of instability amid rising domestic and international uncertainties. The Chinese government wants to play down the trade war because of the uncertainties, as the government, to some extent, is rethinking its position and its strategy in the trade war, he said. They don't want to highlight the uncertainties, preferring to highlight stability and continuity, how Trump and Xi saved the world from economic pain and turned the trade war into a win-win situation, but not everyone is convinced. Doris Zhang, who works in a pharmaceutical company in Beijing, said she had started to change part of her salary into US dollars due to fears the trade rift would exacerbate China's economic slowdown. But I would prefer to buy American products rather than domestic-made products because the US usually has the strongest technologies in the world, she said. Li Wei, an international relations expert at Renmin University in Beijing, has warned against a long-term standoff as the tariff war expands into a full-scale geopolitical competition between the US and China. China takes steps to support jobs as trade war starts to hit employment. Last week, a group of China experts and scholars in the US warned that Beijing was attempting to influence American society on a wide scale, including through local governments, universities, think tanks, media, corporations and the Chinese-American community. Their report, Chinese Influence and American Interests, published by the Hoover Institution and the Asia Society Center of U.S.-China Relations, echoed the themes of U.S. Vice President Mike Pence's speech in October, in which he accused Beijing of using its influence to interfere in the domestic policies and politics of the U.S. Meanwhile, as previously reported in the South China Morning Post, the U.S. Embassy in Beijing revoked 10-year multiple-entry visas issued to some Chinese researchers into Sino-U.S. relations, without explanation, amid tightened visa scrutiny. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence accuses China of trying to undermine Donald Trump. The distrust against each other is growing in the two societies, and in China there have also been critical voices against the U.S., Li said, adding that America's public suspicions against China appeared to be more negative than Chinese attitudes towards the U.S. This is a terrible outcome as intensified distrust among the public, especially over the escalating clash on ideologies, would result in a long-term standoff between the U.S. and China, he said. Governments, for their own interests, could quickly make peace after fighting, but it would be far more difficult to overturn public sentiment if such distrust intensified.